I think we can go ahead and get started. So again, thank you for joining us today for our Pediatric Tech Talk. Again, I'm Leanne West, and I'm Chief Engineer of Pediatric Technology at Georgia Tech. And today we are going to be speaking with Omer Inan about new wearable technology for pediatric bioengineering applications and team science-focused clinical problems. So he does some really interesting things, and I'm super excited to hear about them. And Omer, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Omar. I'm professor in electrical and computer engineering at Georgia Tech. I'm an adjunct in biomedical engineering, and I'm fortunate to lead a lab of students and postdocs who do amazing work that are at the interface between non-invasive physiological sensing and modulation and clinical problems.
And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about your work. Maybe tell us about some of the individual projects that you think are really exciting right now.
Sure. So I guess I kind of separate in my head the projects we're doing in the lab in kind of three areas. So one of them is focused on very heavily on cardiovascular sensing and analytics, where we focus on especially the vibrations and sounds of the body and use those to be able to capture the state of patients with heart failure, hypertension, in a way that leads to clinically actionable information that can then be used, hopefully, to titrate care in the future. So that's kind of one bin of what we do. And the second area is kind of around joint health sensing. So we've done quite a bit of work on wearable sounds and bioimpedance measurements from the knee and other joints to be able to assess inflammation in patients with arthritis, as well as to assess injury status and rehab status and sports medicine kind of applications as well. And the third area we work on is really probably what we'll talk about the most today, which is pediatric bioengineering. So we are involved in several projects that are related to sensing analytics that can affect pediatric safety and care.
Very cool. So why don't we talk a little bit about the IV infiltration detection system that you're working on?
Absolutely. So this project is one of the ones where, so I guess I'm excited about all my projects, honestly, but this is one that we're super excited about. We've been working on it since, I guess, 2014. And it really started when you, Leanne, came to, us and told us about this really important clinical problem that had been identified by clinicians, nurses at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. And really now we know much more broadly, really at any pediatric hospital and beyond that, even in adults as well, chemotherapy and many other applications as being this super important problem affecting patient safety. And it's this problem of IV infiltration. Basically, many of us have probably had an IV at some point in our lives where the needle has to go into one of our veins. The idea is to deliver fluid, nutrients, medicine to the person through their veins directly. And it's used in almost all hospitalized patients, right? But what can happen, unfortunately, is that fluid can inadvertently fill into the extravascular space, basically all of that tissue surrounding the vein, instead of going into the vein directly. This can cause a tissue to balloon. It can cause all kinds of major issues, especially if the medication used is something that's caustic, which can actually lead to tissue damage and death locally. So we started working on this project in 2014. It was kind of literally an idea on a whiteboard that, you and I started drawing up together and talking through. And from there, we leveraged some of the technologies that my lab was already working on. We built prototypes. We moved it through to an exciting point. And of course, I'm happy to discuss that more here as well.
Yeah, so I think the whole journey with IV infiltration has been really interesting and really fun to work on. And I know, you mentioned that it can cause damage to the tissues, especially for an infant. If you eat away at the muscle and skin and tendons of the child where the site of the IV is, it's permanently disfiguring. It can cause permanent problems. And so it's really important to get this right, I know. Do you want to tell us a little bit maybe about where you are with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really come a long ways, right? It's we've taken it from those kind of whiteboard sketches out to multiple iterations of physical prototypes, where now we have actually a very well-refined wearable system that can sit right around that IV site and that can in real time sense and also process the data from that person to be able to determine if an infiltration has taken place. And the algorithms are at this point mature enough where we've frozen them, which is kind of a medical device term, where essentially we're ready to test it in a real clinical study. That would be our pivotal trial that could be used for regulatory submission. We've also gotten the device all the way to the point where we're on the verge of freezing the hardware as well. We're talking to actually a strategic partner that of course I can't name, but that is that would be a fantastic partner to work with to try to get this out of the lab and into commercialization. And it's at a very, very exciting point where I think it could really become a product that ends up helping patients.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that I know that this was in partnership with our collaborators at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, and they have just been wonderful to work with. The nurses there especially are so excited about this technology. And I know you collected data at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta to help you build that algorithm.
That's right.
Maybe tell us a little bit about what you found when you collected data from Children's.
Yeah. So first of all, so Kevin Marr was the clinician we first worked with there, who is one of my favorite collaborators on any project that I've ever worked with. A great person who really cares about making a difference and is super innovative. So, and I have to say the same, honestly, for everybody we've worked with there. So Sadie Rodriguez was the one that we actually worked with for this latest clinical study. And on the nursing side, Amy Parker and Lynn Pogue are two of the most passionate people I've ever met. They were the ones that we were first talking to and have really kept in touch with us and kept helping us to make sure that the directions we go with the technology can actually be clinically relevant and can make a difference. And I've never met people who care more about their clinical population that they care for. I mean, deeply personally, you can tell that this is something that they care about more than anything else. So it's been fantastic. So we did run a clinical study at Children's that was about now maybe 2 years ago, where we recruited a total of about 60 patients. It was kind of all-comers recruitment. There was, of course, some exclusion criteria that we had based on the institutional review board approval there. But essentially, we didn't want to limit it to, say, just one IV site or one small age group of patient or one particular medication or flow rate. We wanted to understand in a fairly general set of conditions how well our technology could detect the infiltration events. So we had a wearable that at that time we refined with GCMI, which is a global center for medical innovation, which is a partner that my lab works with frequently on these sorts of projects. And we basically made it so it would be safe and easy to use for clinicians there and study staff at Children's. And then we placed this on the patients. We measured the data, stored it, and then in post-processing, we examined the data to see if we could have detected these infiltrates 60 minutes to even more earlier than when the nurse detected them. And the result looked great. I mean, we believe that result was strong enough without applying any black box algorithms or machine learning or anything like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but as a first stage, we'd try to use biophysics-based models because we think they can generalize better, and that's what we did. And we feel confident now that we can freeze the algorithm and use that same algorithm going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I know that, when we spoke to the nurses originally, they told us that if we could detect it within a 30-minute window, then we could really stop the really bad things from happening to these kids if there is an infiltration. And so we're able to detect it much earlier than that.
Yes.
Super exciting.
Yes.
And then, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and I think the reason we found for that was, one of the challenges with bioimpedance, this is getting just technical for a second here, but one of the challenges with bioimpedance is that it's so different person to person, and it can change for a variety of reasons, like if the person moves or if the skin temperature changes. So we were expecting actually that there would be a lot of noise in this measurement, and there is, and we have to deal with that, and we were ready for that. But one of the things I think we did not expect was the degree to which it's so obvious in the bioimpedance signal
Yeah.
when the fluid is really accumulating locally. Because yes, there's noise, but you see these giant changes in bioimpedance that are much bigger than what we had expected from our other work in joint health and other sort of areas, cardiac even, where bioimpedance is used frequently, where I was first exposed to bioimpedance as a technology. And so yeah, we were able to detect it earlier than we expected, and it was really kind of a surprising thing that we're very pleased to see.
Absolutely. And yeah, because usually data analytics is not that straightforward, but the data here is very clear, and that's just amazing. So you mentioned GCMI, which is the Global Center for Medical Innovation. They are a Georgia Tech affiliate that can work with anyone, not just Georgia Tech, but I know you're working with them closely because they're helping with things like the manufacturing, what a final prototype might look like, but they also helped you build one that was usable by Children's Healthcare of Atlanta.
Yep.
Maybe talk about that relationship with them and some of the things that you've done with them.
Oh yeah. Well, we have done probably, I guess, 5 or 6 projects with them at least with my lab. And it has ranged from, really has covered their full range of capabilities also. We've done animal studies with them. I had a collaborator for those studies, Chris Rolfus, who was fantastic to work with on a project that's entirely different, right? It was a DoD funded effort that was focused on hypovolemia, where we were using pigs as the model for that. And it was super successful, led to Science Advances publication, as well as multiple other publications and grants where we sort of, moved into this new area of using wearable sensing for assessing blood volume status in hemorrhage. But also now on this project, we're working with GCMI on their other side of things, which is really focusing on commercialization and translation. So we've been specifically focused on the quality management systems, making sure that all the documentation is in place. We know the verification and validation steps that are required for moving the technology towards regulatory submission. They've helped us interface with a regulatory consultant who has set up a FDA pre-submission inquiry meeting for us that we're having actually in just a couple of weeks. And so it's been a great partnership. And I have to say that, of course, the CEO of GCMI is Sherry Ferrugia, who is one of my close friends and somebody that was previously involved on this project in a totally different role, which was really in interfacing between Georgia Tech and Children's. And she has really helped us to overcome some huge obstacles along the way. And now it's wonderful to have her in that capacity as a partner to work with us as well.
Absolutely. I know that she has really brought some great things to GCMI, and I love the way, I'm seeing everything grow, all the different relationships that she's developed. So that's wonderful. So how about this? Let's talk about one of your other projects. I heard you mention the microphone technology. Maybe you could talk
Oh, yeah.
about that and its applications to sports and, juvenile arthritis or anything like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, when I was first starting here, I went to this DARPA PI meeting. So DARPA is Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's a DoD agency focused on really risky but impactful early stage research. And so they had this event that was in DC and was focused around wearable technologies for advancing musculoskeletal health and performance in soldiers. And one of the things that really stuck with me at that meeting was that their physiologist who was with the US Army was mentioning how little there is in terms of technology to quantify the health of joints, and how, since musculoskeletal injuries are one of the leading causes, if not the leading cause of discharge for active duty members, this is a huge problem for them. And for sports as well, you're rehabilitating let's say an ACL tear, and you're using markers like pain and discomfort, range of movement, how you're able to perform certain exercises, ultimately like cutting or jumping, as these really important gating points by which you're making key decisions about when you're ready to do one thing or another. Anyway, so after attending that meeting and learning about that from that physiologist, I was on the subway, and I was, of course, stuffed into this meeting for 8 hours in a tiny seat. I'm about 6'7", 320 for people who don't know me in person. And so when I'm stuffed into this tiny seat for 8 hours, my knees were kind of creaky. And honestly, on the subway, I had this idea. In industry, I had just worked previously on these tiny microphones that were used for pro audio, basically Broadway theaters, Hollywood sound, that kind of thing. And so the idea kind of came to me like, hey, maybe we can put microphones or other sorts of acoustic sensors into knee braces, measure the sounds from the joint, and that may tell us something about what's going on structurally inside of the knees. So we started working on this with the DARPA funding. A couple years after we started that project, we started getting some exciting results from sports med applications. And then Kevin Marr, who I mentioned earlier, saw a talk that I gave on the technology and said, hey, I want to connect you to my neighbor in the Health Sciences Research Building, who is actually the chief of pediatric rheumatology at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. And that's Dr. Prahalad. Dr. Prahalad and I met in his office. We chatted for maybe 45 minutes to an hour, and we both came out of it super excited to work together, because he works with patients with juvenile idiopathic arthritis, where if you think for sports medicine, we don't have enough tools to quantify how someone's doing, it's even more so the case by far when it comes to arthritis and when it comes to juvenile arthritis in particular. So we've been working together now for maybe 6 or 7 years and have done some really fun stuff that can hopefully impact kids with arthritis and help them to have better markers of how their joints are doing.
Yes, so I know I can totally relate to hearing my knees creak and pop when I stand up sometimes or squat, whatever I might be doing. And so I love that, this idea just kind of came to you, in the subway after a meeting and, feeling your own knees. I think that's, that kind of inspiration is great. And I think that always leads to something really incredible. So I do know with your joint sound project, I mean, you are actually able to hear the sounds that a joint makes and differentiate between one that's healthy and one that's not. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the research you've done there, some of the things you've done to really show that that works.
Yeah, I mean, so it's been super interesting. And now I think we actually have a very good hypothesis for why the sounds from someone with a flare-up with arthritis are so different than someone who is healthy, or even someone with arthritis that's not flaring up at that time. And we think that it's because of the thickening of the synovium. So, there's this sort of, the knee is encased with soft tissue, and as the knee becomes inflamed, some of those tissues become thicker. And so the friction of rubbing of those tissues against the bones and the ligaments inside can change. And we think that actually the changes during in arthritis when somebody has a flare-up are due to those frictional rubbing sounds. And so we have some interesting studies that we're planning where we want to correlate to MRI and these sorts of things to really get at the science of that. But it was because of this data collection, actually, which stemmed from a Pediatric Technology Center seed grant. That's how we were able to do this in the first place. And then move towards NSF, National Science Foundation, the Career Award, and also some foundation funding that we have now that's allowed us to really mature the technology and better understand what we're measuring.
Yeah, and you mentioned MRI. I know that MRI is kind of the gold standard. So can you talk a little bit about what kind of benefit it is to kids to not have to have an MRI?
Well, for a lot of these kids, when they get an MRI, they also require sedation. And, so It's very expensive. It's a burden on the families, of course, and on the kids. It's uncomfortable, and it's something that really can only be done. In many kids, they won't even do it, right? Unless they really need to do an MRI. And if they do need to do one, maybe they'll do it once to try to diagnose what's going on. But to be able to follow a kid, let's say, and see how well is a treatment working for them, are they kind of doing better, or do they need some other types of therapies? There's many options for JIA, juvenile idiopathic arthritis, and it's not clear which ones will work best for a certain patient. A lot of it's trial and error. And so the sorts of treat to target approaches that are used in adults with rheumatoid arthritis can't be directly employed right now for JIA. So to be able to serially continue to observe how someone's doing, MRI is just not an option at all. But even for that initial diagnosis, it's really a major burden on kids, and it can be uncomfortable and expensive. The other thing that's kind of interesting and surprising that I didn't know starting this project is there are not that many pediatric rheumatologists in the US, to the point where the average distance someone has to travel to see a pediatric rheumatologist is 200 miles. So, having technologies that are more remotely accessible, let's say for general, pediatricians or physical therapists, would be actually super beneficial from that standpoint as well.
Yeah, and I was even thinking along the lines of you could use this microphone technology in the office for a regular visit, as opposed to
Exactly.
having to have a whole nother visit for the MRI also.
Exactly.
But you do bring up an interesting point as well. Could kids one day be wearing this at home and in their daily life to kind of listen for these sounds and to see when changes are happening?
That's where we want to go
Okay.
eventually. There's a lot of steps we have to kind of get through to get there, but that's where we want to go. And we've done some at-home recordings in adults with arthritis as well as joint injuries. So we have the capability to send some of these systems home. For kids, though, there's more that has to be done on the technology side to get there. The
Mhm.
braces that we've made have been funded through DoD, so they've been made for adults. So we don't have knee wraps, and it's, before I got into pediatric tech, I would think just make it smaller, it'll work, right? No, it's actually not the case at all. Kids are growing, kids move in different ways, kids use stuff in different ways, they do different types of activities than adults. So it's not as simple as just make it smaller. We all know that at this point. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for the technology to be refined along those lines.
Mhm.
But yes, definitely our goal would be that you could get even more frequent and ubiquitous data from kids at home, which would then lead to maybe changes in terms of their behaviors, the way that they're performing exercises,
Mhm.
but also, of course, to therapies, medicines, when you should get an injection, when maybe you'd do better with anti-inflammatories, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I have one more question, but I know that there's two questions in the chat.
Oh,
And
great.
we have about 5 minutes left. But my question is just briefly, when do you think technologies like these two that you've spoken about today could actually be available for use in the clinic or at home? And what's the time horizon there?
Yeah. So, my lab is super interested in getting stuff out and actually commercializing. So we do have two startups. One is focused on the cardiovascular technology I was talking about at the beginning. That's a company called CardioSense. That
Mhm.
technology is older from my lab. And so it's at that point where we were able to commercialize it. And hopefully that one will be, in a few years, will be something that could be available. We also have a startup focused on joint health monitoring called Arthroba that we just started much more recently, just a few months ago. That one is going to be focused on adults with osteoarthritis, but ultimately, if we got some great results in juvenile arthritis, it could be something that ends up maybe getting licensed or being commercialized through them. That type of thing accelerates the process quite a bit, because otherwise a new company has to be founded, new funding has to be obtained. And so we're hoping that the existence of that company may allow some of the juvenile arthritis technologies to hopefully be accelerated to market at some point. For the IV infiltration detection, actually, if we're able to license it to a partner that has the manufacturing capabilities, distribution capabilities to be able to get into clinical settings, that one might be honestly the soonest one of all these to get to the bedside and make a difference. maybe in a couple of
Wonderful.
years would be my
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah, that's amazing and super exciting. So we do have a couple of questions in chat. We have one that says, what's next in the IV infiltration pathway to broader use, and what do you need to keep it moving forward?
Yeah, so there's we have the detailed answer and sort of the high level answer. High level answer is we want to get connectivity, interconnectivity right. So we want to make sure that we're able to connect to the right IT systems within the hospitals to be able to deliver the alerts to caregivers properly in a way that they want that, and that can be used properly to make better decisions. Of course, we need to get regulatory clearance on the device and the algorithm. For that, we think we have a pretty good road ahead, and it's more just resources to allow us to do that. So we are trying to raise some funds to be able to handle that. Within that also is some external testing of our device and hardware to make sure that it hits the right standards that are required for FDA clearance. And so we need to do those. And of course, the pivotal study, which will be something that once everything is ready, all the testing has been done, the study has to be done that will support the FDA submission. After that, it's really, ready to be manufactured, and there will of course be a partner that we have to work with to make it so the manufacturing is repeatable and we have the right tests in place and all that, but it's development effort to get it out there.
Wonderful. And then the other question is, and this is probably our last, but I will say before we leave, if you have a question and didn't have a chance to ask it, please send it to me or Sherry or Omer, and we are happy to get it to you after the meeting. But the last question is, this kind of inflammation, so I'm assuming it's talking about the arthritis, can occur in several different ways. Do you think your data could perhaps distinguish between these different types of inflammation?
That's a great question. Yeah, no, I think that we have, so I've talked a lot about the sounds, but we also measure bioimpedance in that context. And we have some really early stage work where we're doing active sensing, where we're actually vibrating the bone and the tendons and looking at the vibration responses. And the ideas there are that we want to be able to look at not only synovial thickening that may affect the sounds, but also synovial volume, which is effusions and edema locally in the tissue. And with the vibrations, we can look more into the tendons and the possible stiffening and remodeling that occurs in those longer term. For example, in enthesitis related arthritis, there's issues with those connections between the ligaments and tendons and the bones. And so with that, we're hoping that we can have a sort of a multidimensional picture of what's going on. So it's all non-invasive technology, but it's kind of getting at the problem in different ways to try to detect some of those things.
Wonderful. Well, you know that you're your research is some of my favorite on campus. I love that it's actually getting out, into the real world. That's the goal. And I'm super excited to see some of these things happen. Before we leave, is there anybody else who has a question? If not, again, Sherry put our email addresses in the chat. If you have something you want to ask, we can answer it later, certainly. This is also going to be available on our website as a recording. And so if you think somebody else might be interested in what we talked about today, please feel free to share it. But thank you so much for spending time with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. No, thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks. Always great to chat with you, of course.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.